Good day. This video is about the history of Foggy Bottom, a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. The structure of the video is as follows. We're going to discuss the location of the neighborhood. I'm going to propose a thesis about its historical evolution and importance. We are going to go subsequently to visit monuments and buildings in the neighborhood. And at the end of the visits, I'm going to propose an analysis and some final concluding words. Location and importance. Foggy Bottom essentially is between Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenues, and broadly speaking, between 25th and 17th Streets. The key thing to know is that right here in this corner, Foggy Bottom, is the White House. And next to the White House, exactly on 17th Avenue, is the Eisenhower Building, which houses the offices of the Vice President of the United States. The State Department is over here. George Washington University is about here. The Treasury Department is only a few blocks about here. The governors of the Federal Reserve Board sit on Constitution Avenue. The Organization of American States is on 17th Avenue. And then in the middle here, very close to Pennsylvania, about 19th Street, are the offices of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. My thesis is that Foggy Bottom has functioned as the policy support hub of empire. Yes, the United States began as a relatively small country, 13 colonies, but very quickly became the regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And by the end of the 19th century, it already projected power around the world after it took from Spain, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Subsequently, we all know the United States helped win the First World War, and after the Second World War, it became not only the global empire, but also the most important economic power in the world. Throughout this time, people supporting the policies that were driving this expansion were located here. This is Washington Circle. This is a equestrian statue of George Washington, dedicated in 1860. This marks the upper left-hand corner of Foggy Bottom from the Potomac. It is a very nice place that demarcates the hub of an imperial capital. Only 0.7 miles from here is the White House. It takes 17 minutes to walk from here. This is, in other words, the capital of a nation that just became independent in 1776. The city was, as you know, founded in 1790, and in a short period went from national capital to the capital of a federation of a growing number of states, and eventually to the capital of an empire, Washington. We are at George Washington University in Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. Right in front of us is the James Monroe Hall. James Monroe was president of the United States in the early 1800s, and he was the one who established as a policy what is called the Monroe Doctrine. Please note, the United States had just been created. Washington was, as you know, founded in 1790. By 1823, the ambitious new country, United States, was ready to exercise the role of regional leader, because the Monroe Doctrine essentially told the Europeans and any other power around the world, stop. You cannot continue to colonize Latin America.
And if you interfere and try to do something, you'll have to face us. Yeah, to compensate, we're not going to interfere with anything you do in Europe. That was pretty much what happened. This established the U.S. as a regional leader, and in 1895, when Venezuela was attacked by the British Navy because they were not paying their debts, they came running to Washington and asked for protection on the basis of the Monroe Doctrine. And those emerged by 1898, when, by the way, the United States, now more powerful, industrial, and with a military and a navy, declared a war on Spain and took from Spain Cuba and Puerto Rico. On the basis of the Monroe Doctrine, the American government was able to firmly cement its role as a regional leader and begin to project power as a global leader. Certainly, in the years that followed, the United States declared or invaded, intervened in Honduras, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Grenada. Certainly, this man, who does not have a statue in Washington, D.C., only a building named after him, was an important part of this. Now, during this period, after the Monroe Doctrine, President James Polk, against popular opinion, and in the midst of an outcry in the United States, launched a war against Mexico in 1846 to 1848. As a result of that war, the United States captured or obtained, if you want, in so many different ways, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and many others. In other words, the dream of growing the United States to the other coast, to the West Coast, became a reality. That was all thought and planned a half a mile from here at the White House, with the support of the state and Navy departments that were placed right here. That's why this video proposes that Foggy Bottom is the support of a growing empire at that time that will become the most powerful empire in the last 1,000 years by 1945. We are in Foggy Bottom. The State Department is that way. The Watergate Hotel is right there. The Watergate Hotel, as you know, has plenty of political consequences. And right here is the statue of Benito Juarez, President of Mexico in the 1800s. He had to deal with the fact that James Polk, President of the United States, decided to invade Mexico and essentially took a large portion of the country and make it part of the United States in order to conclude the dream of becoming a country that would go from sea to sea. By the way, James Polk not only took this big swath of territory from the Mexicans, he also intrigued and manipulated to extract parts of the Northwest from the British. But anyway, the point is, Benito Juarez is here. This statue was dedicated in 1968, and it reads, "From the people of Mexico to the people of the United States." It's really intriguing to see how the Mexicans, a country that has benefited from the fact that many Mexicans have immigrated to the United States, but the United States took a large part of its country, now turn around and say, here, we'll give you a statue of the president that had to deal with the consequences of the loss of territory. At the same time, as I mentioned in another clip, James Polk is nowhere to be seen. It is as if Americans might not be that happy about what James Polk did, which is surprising. His name is only in this area, as I mentioned in another clip, in a building that is in Arlington, across the river. This is the Eisenhower Executive Building, which houses all the offices of the Vice President of the United States. He does have an office in the West Wing, but his staff are located here. Now, the original building was completed in 1888, and it was at that time he hosted the offices of the State, War, and Navy departments. It is clearly contiguous to the White House, and on this road down that way, we will find the Red Cross offices or headquarters, the Organization of American States, and turning the corner on Constitution, we're going to find the Federal Reserve. This is St. Mary's Episcopal Church, the first Episcopal church that cared for African Americans in Washington, D.C. This used to be, this area of Washington, D.C., which is the 23rd and H, used to be, and going down to the Potomac, used to be an area that was populated by all ethnicities, including African Americans, and walks of life. There were many employees of the government, but there also, at that time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was industry here, including two breweries we're going to talk about in another clip. So people here in this neighborhood they were attending multiple churches, but this was the first one, opened in 1867, although the building you see here was constructed in 1887. We are on the back of the Saudi Arabian embassy near Virginia Avenue. This is 25th Street. And this, as you can see, is 66. And there are roads that take you from Washington and to Washington from Virginia. The Potomac River is that way. Now, why are we here? Very close to here, the Google map says in 25th and F and 26th and D, there were two big industries in the late 1800s and 1900s that provided employment for people of all walks of life and ethnicities, including African Americans. Both of them were brewing companies. There was also a shipyard near the Potomac. The most perhaps famous brewing company was the Christian Urich Brewing Company, that used to produce a beer that was popular in Washington, the Senate Lager. And then the other one, brewery was in this area beginning in 1895 through 1954. And it had been founded in 1872 in the Pond Circle, but eventually moved here in 1895. The other one was the Abner Drury Brewery that also was in this area. These were big employers for, people, as I said, living in what at that time was residential, middle class, lower class, residential, Foggy Bottom. That changed with the efforts to beautify the city and also to expand the federal government buildings and to create parks and so on. As we have learned in the book that we're reading in class, Washington, D.C. started very small and only developed gradually. We know that by the 1840s, 1850s, efforts to create a sewage system was in place, but that sewage system did not cover the whole city, and also transportation was only gradually being improved with changes in technology, improvements in technology. Already in the late 1800s, there have been calls in the United States, but also in other countries in Europe, to improve urbanization and cities. In the case of the United States, these calls for improving the cities were not only in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Detroit, Kansas, and Cleveland were a part of the effort. And also they are related to what we saw in the book as the Chicago Exposition in the late 1800s, 1893, that demonstrated the uses of electricity and other innovations. So in 1901, the Senate created the so-called Park Commission that produced a report by 1902, the plan called Macmillan for the person who headed the design of this plan. As part of the plan, the idea was, I think, to make sure that Washington could compete with London, Paris as capitals of great powers. Eventually, the capital of an empire. And because of that, or at least in part because of that, they decided to essentially change the face of the big part of Foggy Bottom, and everything you see here, the 66 and all those approaches to Washington, did not exist. They had to be built on top of places that were previously residential areas. That's how a big change in the composition of the residents of Washington, D.C., Foggy Bottom, took place. One of the largest institutions in Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C., is the George Washington University here that covers 43 acres and has about 27,000 students as of 2021. The university moved to Foggy Bottom in 1904, but the precursor of the university was called Columbia College, and it started with funds that were donated by George Washington University. That's why it's called this. It was founded in 1821, and today it offers doctoral degrees and all kinds of sciences at the moment. It's one of the most important employers at Foggy Bottom. This is the Federal Reserve building in Constitution Avenue, Washington, D.C., Foggy Bottom. It is the office of the governors. As you know, the Federal Reserve System has regional banks in New York, Kansas, etc. But this is the place where, the big decisions have been made for a long time. Now, why is this important? For an empire, the kind like we have today, the United States, a key pillar of that power is its currency, the US dollar. And this is the institution that makes sure, through the setting of monetary and exchange rate policy, that the dollars, the green pieces of paper you carry in your wallets, are worth something today. Okay? That not only for you, but all citizens around the world that have and trust in the US dollar. So therefore, the projection of power for an empire requires an institution such as this. So it turns out that the day I came, they are rebuilding or doing something, and there is a big parade or protesters. I don't know what they are, but the main message is that we're on 17th Street, Foggy Bottom, of the headquarters of the American Red Cross. It was founded in 1881, and this building was completed in 1917. It has played a tremendous, helpful, and generous role in attending to the wounded in the First Great War in the 1914 to 17 and 18, and then the Second World War and all the other wars. Countries have been very grateful for the role of the American Red Cross elsewhere. It is a way in which Washington and Foggy Bottom have projected benevolent power across the world. We are at the corner of 23rd Street and East Street in Washington, D.C., certainly very much within Foggy Bottom. The Washington Circle is just head in this road. In front of us is the building of the Pan American Health Organization. The Pan American Health Organization was formally created in 1949, in the sense that it was merged with the United Nations that had just been created after the war. But in fact, the precursor of the Pan American Health Organization was the Pan American Health Bureau, created in 1902 by Americans and Latin Americans to take care of tropical diseases. This marks one of the first attempts of the United States, Washington, to cooperate with the rest of the region in order to do something that would be good for everyone. And this is the control of tropical diseases and also other very bad diseases, including in 1950, WHO and the World Health Organization and the US joined together in launching an eradication campaign against smallpox. By the end or by the mid-1990s, the smallpox had been virtually eradicated. We're on 17th Street. The White House is over there. The Washington Monument is over there. And this is the headquarters of the Organization of American States. This is the way in which the United States, beginning in the 1940s when the charter was concluded, has had influence at the highest levels over policies in Latin America. This building was dedicated in 1910. But before, how come the charter was concluded in 1940s, but this was dedicated in 1910? Because the precursor organization was the Pan American Union, which was created in 1890. As you can imagine, after the Americans invading Mexico, taking part of it, and then invading Nicaragua and other countries, Latin Americans thought it would be a good idea to talk to American politicians and American government. So he insisted on, having some sort of quorum conference that would enable them to exchange views. This is the result. The Organization of American States. Inside, when there is trouble in Latin America, a coup, a revolution, or anything like that, they convene the foreign ministers and they try to reach a solution here. We are at 1917th Street, the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund. It was created at the end of the World War through a conference in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that also created the sister institution, the building that is in front of us, the World Bank. The purpose was simple. It was to cement the power of the United States as the leading capitalist free world country in the world. These two institutions were going to do two things. First, the IMF was going to oversee that financing and trading among nations would be done according to certain rules. And then a second role emerged for the IMF, one of being the lender of last resort. When countries accumulated so much deficits and had so little international reserves that they could not, or they risk a fiscal crisis, a currency crisis, a banking crisis, when no one else can help, they come here. They don't come here because they want to. They come here because they have to. As a result, since 73, and particularly in the 80s and 90s, the free demonstrations have gathered in Washington to protest the policies of the IMF, which invariably ask for austerity and a reduction of the fiscal deficit. We are at 1818 H Street. This is Elwell Morrow Park, the park that hosts the core of the demonstrations that happen during the spring meetings in April and during the annual meetings in October of the World Bank building here and the IMF, the building over there across the street on 1919, on 19th Street. The role of the World Bank has changed over the years. After the war in 1945, this bank was created for the reconstruction of Europe. In fact, its first name was not the World Bank. The first name was the International Bank for Reconstruction of Europe, EBRD, and Development. Now, over time, as Europeans grew and recovered, that including through the help of the U.S. Engineer Marshall Plan in the Treasury and the White House, which are about 3 blocks from here, the World Bank changed its purpose to assist the development of the rest of the world, particularly developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Unfortunately, Some of the choices that the bank makes, for example, for the construction of a big hydroelectric plant, or perhaps in support of the IMF for some austerity and greater sense in fiscal policy, are the subject of protest by some people. And that's why, as I said, every year when this meeting is not here, this institution have to pay extra money to Washington police. We are on Pennsylvania Avenue, right in front of the second building of the IMF. And right here we have behind us the Embassy of Mexico. Foggy Bottom houses, accommodates, is a residence for many foreign embassies. But the interesting thing about the Embassy of Mexico is that, as you know, in the 1990s and then 20 years later, it negotiated with the United States the North American Free Trade Treaty, NAFTA, that was renegotiated, as I said, by President Trump in the first period, and apparently he's trying to renegotiate it again. But in any case, the Mexicans were visionaries in the sense that they knew they wanted to be close to the White House, close to the State Department a few blocks from here, and of course, close to the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, in the 1990s, a big crisis emerged, and they had to rush to the IMF for help, and it was the IMF decided to help in concert with the Treasury, which is something that has been unusual, to have the IMF and the U.S. Treasury working together to rescue a country. That happened at that time, and as I said, these people, the Mexicans, saw the convenience of being close to the sources of power in Washington. As I said, the White House, where all the decisions are made, are 3 blocks from here. And this is not unique for the Mexicans. Whenever countries get into trouble, they rush to the IMF, to the World Bank, and then they only walk a few blocks towards the U.S. Treasury, which is right next to the White House. Or if they are Latin Americans and they have political problems, like in Venezuela, for example, they walk a few blocks down to the Organization of American States. We are here in front of the gates of the Embassy of Saudi Arabia in Foggy Bottom, just a few steps from Virginia Avenue in the State Department. Again, like the Mexicans, they are located very close to power. As I said, you go to the White House, to the Capitol, to everywhere from here. As you know, the Saudi Arabians have been instrumental in permitting the rise of the empire in the United States. By agreement they made after the Second World War, the oil price is denominated in dollars. In exchange for that, the Saudi Arabians extracted from the U.S. a promise of security. So again, you have Washington, Foggy Bottom, projecting power across the goals.
Today, the State Department is right here, between 23rd, 22nd, and C and E Street. When the U.S. government began, at the time of George Washington, it had 4 employees. By the end of the 1950s, it had about 8,000. Today, it has 80,000. Most of the employees of the State Department that are in the United States are located somewhere here. The importance of this is that this is essentially walking distance to the offices of the Vice President and the President of the United States. Very close to the State Department, from 1942 to 1945, there was, right here, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. Analytical discussion. An analysis has to conclude that the agglomeration of bureaucratic, technocratic staff, policy power in Foggy Bottom is simply a reflection of the accumulation of economic and military power by what was first a small nation and then became a regional hegemon and eventually an empire. In conclusion, Foggy Bottom is the place where the basic work is done for the decisions that are made by the White House every day and that feed financial markets and economic activity around the world. Questions for further discussion. What could have happened if the United Nations, instead of being located in New York, would have been located in Washington, D.C.? Most likely, the situation of Foggy Bottom would be different today. There would be even less residential space and more office space. But it would continue to be the core of an empire.